Happy Friday, guys, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Dubs. I'm your host, Bill T. Well, it's Friday, and it's time for another podcast, and we've got a great one for you today. If you happen to have this month's Hot VWs, December 2024, you're going to want to check it out because it's a perfect companion to go along with this podcast. But before we get into that, don't forget to support our sponsors. VW Trends Magazine, not the same old stuff. Lots of how-tos, lots of cool stuff. Matter of fact, I just got my new issue last week. So the volume 4, number 2, fall of 2024 is out. And what's super cool is on the cover is Jamie's Toy, a car built by Bob Cook out there in Cooker's VWs in Maryland. And he's got a car that was featured on the cover of VW Trends back in the 80s. And so he bought that car, restored it, put a big fat turbo motor in it like Bob does. And it's on the cover of this month's VW Trends Magazine. So don't forget, go support VW Trends Magazine. Go subscribe today at VWTrendsMagazine.com. Also, Ross Wolf, SEMA's in town this week. And guess what? Ross Wolf just came out with the new Viton pushrod tube seals. That's right. No more junky leaking pushrod tube seals. Now we got them made out of Viton. So go check them out today at rosswolf.com. So you get your Viton pushrod seals. You can get your cloth wrapped high performance plug wires. I mean, you can really get your car outfitted. So go check them out today at rosswolf.com. That's Ross Wolf with a U.com. So we all know what it's like when you get into the hobby and you start to pursue some of these cool cars. You'll go down the road like, man, I got to get a new, I've got my 67 bug, and then you find a 55, and then you keep going earlier and earlier. Well, one of our friends and friends of the podcast, Lee Hedges, has been on that trail for a while, and he's a huge Type 34 collector. He runs Type 34 World, the website, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. He also runs the Type 34 Facebook page. So Lee Hedges has been into it for a long time, and nobody better than Lee Hedges to end up with the oldest Type 34 in existence on the registry right now. He's got that car, just finished the restoration, and it's in this month's Hot VW. So if you're looking at your December 2024 issue of Hot VW's magazine, Myers Manx at 60, it says on the cover, get that issue because it's a perfect companion to go along with this podcast. So you can see a lot of the detail stuff. We go over the process of first how the life before the 1962 Type 34 that he owns. One of the super early ones. It's number 1200 on the chassis, but I think he said it was the 11th one produced. So it's definitely one of the early ones, and it's so cool to go through the process of the little variations that were just done just from early 62 to late 62. So many details, so many things, and nobody better to have it than Lee Hedges, who is the guy that's really spearheads the stuff. And what you'll learn is, especially in the Type 34 group, there's a lot of guys that kind of pull parts together and help people here and there. But it's an interesting story of the restoration process. And as we go through the restoration process, there's a lot of uniqueness specifically to the Type 34. This one in particular being an early car. So we go through a lot of those nuances and details that some of you guys really enjoy when we go through that and talk a touch about history here and there. But definitely if you've got a question regarding Type 34s, Lee Hedges is the guy. He eats, sleeps, and breathes Type 34. So it's a great podcast. I know you guys are going to enjoy it. I certainly enjoyed it because there's a lot of information. And every time I do this, I learn something new about Type 34. So it's a great podcast with a lot of information. So on this week's Let's Talk Dubs, it is the oldest Type 34 has been restored, and it's here in the U.S. So on this week's podcast, let's get into it. Oldest Type 34 with Lee Hedges on Let's Talk Dubs.
You probably don't know that there's a new Volkswagen out that doesn't look like a Volkswagen. It's got everything that people who like the bug like. So if you happen to see a good-looking Volkswagen, don't panic.
Okay, everybody. So on today's podcast, if you subscribe to Dune Buggies and Hot VWs, the December 2024 edition has one of our reoccurring guests on, and his car is actually on display. And on today's podcast, we're going to have Lee Hedges on the show today, and we're going to discuss with Lee his car that's being featured this month, which happens to be the oldest Type 34 in the registry. So on today's podcast, I want to welcome Lee Hedges from Type 34 World and also Type 34 collector, Type 3 collector in general. Lee, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me back.
Hey, so congratulations on your car being featured. And there's lots to talk about. What we're going to get into is the story of this Type 34. Now, if I'm not mistaken, this is the oldest car in the registry.
Yeah, this is the oldest Type 34 ever known to be discovered.
So how many Type 34s currently are in the registry right now?
Currently, the database we have is about 1,805 out of the 42,500 that were built.
Wow. And
wow.
Let's, so you being, I think it's only fitting that you being the Type 34 registry guy that you happen to end up with the oldest one. And I'm sure it's a great story. So let's get into the story of how you got it, how this Type 34 came into your life.
Yeah. And backing up a little bit, when I first started the registry, the database for Type 34s, I archive them all by their chassis numbers. Mm-hmm. And so the beginning of that spreadsheet started at 000 and so on. And so we just keep adding them in line. And so it's real easy to track which are the oldest, which are the newest, which are the right-hand drives, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so in 2005 or 6, I got a call from a guy in Arizona who I hadn't met before, but he was a big VW guy, but with bugs and buses, Tim Miller. And Tim said, hey, I got this old, rusty Type 34, and I want to get some help restoring it. And of course, I added him to the group and helped him for over a decade. And that was when he shared the chassis number of it, which is 1200, 1200. So back in those days, the Type 3s were all mixed with Type 34s for chassis numbers. So it's not the 1200th Type 34, it's the 1200th Type 3.
Oh, really?
And yeah, that's how they mixed all those numbers together. And so the VIN number of 1200 doesn't really tell the whole story. It's when you peel back the VIN number on a Type 34, Karmann stamped a little plate in there, a little number, and they started with 100, which was typical for Germans. And this is the 11th Type 34 built ever.
Oh, the 11th. So, well, and they're
the 11th Type 34. Yeah. So I was obviously super excited to add Tim's car to the registry at that point and helped him for about a decade. And then he ran out of patience and money and time and called me back and said, hey, I can't finish this car and I can't think of anybody else that really can, and it deserves to be restored. And I agreed with him. So that's how I ended up having the opportunity to get it.
Now, what year did you buy? Now, this car has got a name?
Yeah. The name of this car is Amy, and we named it Amy for a variety of reasons, but mostly because at the time, Tim's wife's name was Amy, mm-hmm. and it was bought for her. He had bought it to build it for her. That was her dream car. As it goes, I have amigos here in San Diego, so amigos in Spanish and Amy, AMI, is kind of a similar word in French. So it makes sense now that I have so many amigos that helped with the restoration of this car.
Nice. And now I look at a few pictures. I was posting a few pictures of the car when it was sitting in the dirt. Now that's when the car was obviously sitting there is that in Arizona, those pictures?
Yeah, that's in Tucson, Marana, Arizona. And it was out in the dirt in the Arizona red desert. And he had already separated the body from the chassis. It came with no engine, came with mostly no parts. It had 356 gauges installed in the dash that was all hacked up, and it had been sitting outside for 10 years when he got it.
Wow. And so what was the story on the car? Do you know the story before he got the car?
Yeah, the only history we have of it was in about 2005, before he got it. An older lady was driving it, and she pulled into his buddy's shop, VW shop in Phoenix, and it was making noise and rattling and stuff, and we're not running good. And so she pulled into the shop. He climbs underneath it and looks at it and finds that two of the engine hangers, two of the 4 bolts that hold the engine in, had come off, and the engine was kiltered down at a 45-degree angle, and the engine flywheel was rubbing on the transmission housing, causing the noise. I couldn't believe it was still running, but it was obviously in really poor running condition at that time. She just said, "Hey, I can't afford to fix it. I'm going to leave it here. You can have it." And he ended up calling Tim because he knew Tim was into the cool old VWs. So
yeah,
that's the earliest history we have about it. It's weird because Type 34s weren't sold in the U.S. This is the oldest one in the world. How it got to Arizona is anybody's guess. We have no idea.
Now, have you done a birth certificate on this car?
So the funny story on the birth certificate is I would have, and I tried, but this car, the microfiche at Karmann was damaged. And for this chassis number, it's not recorded as a legible microfiche file.
Oh, wow.
So we don't know anything about where it was shipped. We don't know anything about, the production details about it. Because we know the VIN number related to other VIN numbers, we can calculate that the production date was about November 5th or November 6th of 1961.
Oh, so November 5th or 6th. So we're at pretty much a couple days after its birthday, huh?
Yeah. It's 62 years today or yesterday.
That's wild.
So pretty cool. And the Frankfurt Auto Show was going on at that time in September of 61. So this car would have been one of the first built right after the September 1961 Frankfurt Auto Show.
And
pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, that's super cool. Now, what kind of condition was the car in overall when you got it?
So the Arizona desert is great for two things. It's great because it's dry and it's got very low humidity. The problem with Arizona is that it's super hot. So all of the rubber seals, all of the interior, all of the pads, all of anything that wasn't metal was just baked off of the car. Everything was gutted. There were no seats with it. There were no engine, no transmission. Some of the glass was there, but it was horrible. It was just in really, really bad shape. As far as the body goes, it was relatively dry. It had never been hit in the front or the rear. One of the taillights had been hit a little bit, and one of the side fenders had taken a hit to the side a little bit, but nothing major rust-wise, which was a great surprise.
And now, so the body was pretty substantial condition. I mean, it's the red one you sent me the pictures, correct? It's the red, and it was kind of red and white.
It was painted a rusty red.
And with I'm just going on a picture here on the site or on the with the package of pictures you sent me. So yeah, so we're looking at a picture of the dashboard with a 356 gauge. So somebody just grabbed themselves a hole saw and just punched out some big, huge.
Cut it open. So a 356 gauge is about this big.
Yeah.
And the Type 34 gauge is about that big.
Yeah.
And so they opened up the dash and shoehorned them in. They were 1958 Porsche 356 gauges.
So the car overall wasn't in terrible shape. It was, I mean, as far as rust wise. And what percentage completion was the car? Because looking at the image I see here, it looks like it's got late model window cranks in it, like late model Beetle window cranks when you got it.
It was about 20% complete. It had no brakes. It had no lower end. It had no transmission hanger, no trans, no engine, no front end. It was just totally disassembled and separated. No glass, no seats, no pads, no nuts and bolts. We had to find absolutely everything for this car. And that was a huge challenge, of course.
Well, and in the photographs, it looks like the nose was in decent shape.
Yeah.
And what's interesting in this, so on the early cars, I'm looking at the photograph of it here that's on the screen right now, and it's got the Karmann Ghia script on the back tail panel, and it also has it on the lower rear quarters.
Right.
And so that's early. What's the cutoff for because that's early Type 3, right? I mean, or early.
That's early Type 34. 62 only had those set up. The Karmann Ghia script was mounted on the back panel with a 1500 emblem, and that went through the 62 production. And then Volkswagen decided, hey, we don't have Volkswagen on this car, on our Volkswagen Karmann Ghia. So they changed the scripts and put a Volkswagen and a 1500 on the back and moved the Karmann Ghia script up to the deck lid where the normal Karmann Ghia script was located.
And those were the same.
And so beginning in 63, that's when we saw the first Volkswagen script on the car.
And now this car, those logos are the same ones that just they use in the Karmann factory just for the regular Ghias?
No, they're unique to the Type 34s. Even the regular Karmann Ghias didn't use these emblems and scripts. They're unique to the 62 model, only used for 12 months or something. And the side scripts that are on it, a long Karmann script and a Ghia shield were only used on Type 34.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so really hard to find, of course. And we ended up having, for that particular series of parts, having to get reproductions made in Sweden. And one of our fellow guys, Bernd, who's been with us for a long time, probably 30 years, knew that that's what I needed for the earliest cars. Reproduce those scripts and set down. And that's part of the amazing journey of this car was so many people got involved to help because they knew it was worth it. The earliest one, you only get to do it once and you want to do it right. And so everybody was super willing to help out.
And what year did you start building this?
We brought it back from Arizona in late 2016. Mm-hmm. And it took us about 7 years from that point to get it finished.
Now, in the pictures that you'd sent that we looked at, the car was red. Was that not I'm assuming that's not the original color of the car?
So the original color of the car was a ruby red with a black roof, which is a real common color scheme for the Type 34s.
Yeah.
And when I found it, I already had 2 red Type 34s, and I wasn't going to add a third. The other story was when I looked over the 62 colors that were available to Type 34s, my favorite color of all time is this sea blue. And I had an accident back in 2000 in another sea blue Type 34, and the car flipped and landed on its roof and slid down the freeway. And I survived that accident with no harm at all. So I felt it was karma, more or less, to create this car in honor of the sea blue car that saved my life.
Yeah.
And I love sea blue. How can you not, right? The color is just really, really beautiful. It's a color changing color too. So if you look in the dark shadows, it looks a real deep blue. And then in the bright sun, it's almost a light, sun blue. So
right.
It's just a gorgeous color.
Now, when you get a 62, so I just had this last podcast I did was about the Benz double cabs, right? Which are a little more rare than the Type 34s. But,
right.
I said, when you find a car this rare, you better hope it's complete. So with this car not being complete, you had to locate a parts car for this thing?
Yeah, so without an engine, without a transmission, without any of the early brake setup, without the glass, the pads, which are some of them are unique, it was important to find those parts. And I could spend a decade plus trying to search for them one at a time or buy a complete parts car. And so I was lucky at that time to be on the Samba, I think, or in one of the threads, and somebody was talking about a 62 out in Canada, in Eastern Ontario, Canada. And so I followed it, and I contacted my buddy Dave out there, Dave Whittick, and I said, hey, Dave, why don't you learn about this car and go see it? And he volunteered to go drive and check it out. He came back and said, oh, God, it's rusty as all hell. It's a Canadian outdoor car, but it's complete. And it doesn't look like anybody here in Canada wants it, so he's willing to sell it to you to complete this car.
And this is after 2016 when you found this car in Canada.
Yeah, so this would have been 2017, probably mids 2017.
So do you care to say what you have to pay for a completely rotted 62?
What
you had to pay for that rotted 62 parts car?
Okay, so I bought this car for $4,500, separated, incomplete, and then the parts car in Canada I paid $1,500 for, and then when Dave cut it all up for me and shoehorned it into a big wood crate that could fit in the back of a double cab truck, it took, I think it was $1,000 to ship it back here, and probably another $1,000 to build the crate.
So the crate that's in the photograph here is that car cut. It's quartered and sent to put in a crate and shipped over to you.
Yeah, crazy. He got out his Sawzall, separated the car. Most of it fell apart on the lower end because it was so rusty. And then the pieces that I knew I needed, he saved and just started loading them into this hand-built crate he did. And the other parts, like the floor pan that I didn't need, went to local Type 34 owners in Canada. The engine stayed with Dave. The transmission came to me because I didn't have a transmission. And so he just really saved my butt by being able to do all this work, put all those parts in the crate and have it shipped out here. Without that, it just could never have been done correctly.
Now, the differences from a 62 to 63, is there quite a few differences between the 62 and 63?
Yeah. So in the earliest production of Type 34s, or just about any car, they build things and then they run it through the test mill and they get customers' feedback on how things worked, and then they make minor modifications. Well, there were a variety of little things, like the seat knobs to adjust the front seats were put on the outside edge of the seats. Well, when you close the door, you couldn't adjust the seats. You couldn't get your arm in there to adjust the seat rake, to have the rake go forward or backwards. And so those kinds of little things were changed mid-year and after a couple of months of production to different styles. There was also things like the cost of the goods to produce this car were really expensive because they were hand-built, coach-built cars. So in the earliest month of production, they built chromed full metal knobs and realized later on, hey, we could probably get away with a plastic version of that knob. And so they made lots of little changes to the car in the first couple of months of production.
Now, what did you have the chrome knobs? I mean, those chrome knobs, if they're the first 6 months of production, they've got to be like hen's teeth to find.
So the answer is no, we didn't have the chrome knobs. The parts car seats that we bought were the gray plastic knobs, which weren't the ones I wanted for this car. I knew they needed the chrome ones because my other early 62 red car had the chrome knobs, so I knew what I needed. And so I was able to reach out to a guy, again, in Norway who had a second earliest car and knew what they looked like, and he had them reproduced in his auto shop.
Oh, wow.
And we had that set put on this car. So again, just another owner really stepping up to provide parts that I didn't have, that didn't come with the car.
Well, yeah, I think we're all pretty fortunate to know that, right? In the Type 34 world. I mean, we all kind of, if we've got a part sitting around and we've got somebody that's building something and it's for a cause, there's definitely, I know you personally helped me out with the radio bezel that I was looking for Zorba. And, if it weren't for you, I wouldn't have that radio bezel. And
and the same thing, Bill, goes for the early rim, the 15-inch rim you sent me.
Yeah.
That's it right there. So,
I love it.
everybody tries to help each other out when they can, because you want to see more cars on the road.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's how we do it.
So speaking of the early wheels that were on there, because we talked about that earlier in the early Type 3 wheels.
Yeah.
With that wheel. So when I sent you that wheel, were you one wheel short of completing the set, or did you have?
Yeah, I had 4 because the 4 came with the parts car.
Right.
But I needed 5, obviously, to carry a spare in the front.
Right.
And so yours was a better condition rim than one of the 4 that were on the rusty Canadian car. So we put one of the rusty ones after it was sandblasted as a spare, and yours came out clean.
And now,
don't tell anybody that it's a 63 model, okay?
So now, how far apart, like when you're collecting those parts, how far apart are the wheels? I mean, the wheels dated a year, but I mean, obviously you said you had one that's a 63 wheel, but because everything Volkswagen had was stamped, right?
Yeah. The parts car out of Canada was an April 62 car. This is a November 61 car, and all the rims are date stamped. Volkswagen date stamped in a circle, of course, the month and the year. Mm-hmm. And so this car has April 62 rims with the one that you gave me, which I think was a January 63 rim. Mm-hmm. So nobody's going to know. Nobody cares. The rims are identical. So, it's not something that I personally care about having, matching set of chassis dated, date stamped correct rims. Right. I was just super thrilled to get the right parts. Yeah. And get this car complete.
And now the early cars, I mean, the selling point to the Type 34 was like, it was the 1500 series, right? Bigger motor, more power. And it was the first car produced by Volkswagen with twin carburetors, right? Now this particular, the early ones, they had the single side draft?
Yeah. So in the early years, it was a big deal for Volkswagen to produce a 1500cc car. Bugs and buses and Karmann Ghias used a 1200cc at that point. So to jump to a 1500cc was really Volkswagen's entry into the middle class market. More power, more comfort, more space, higher prices. Some would say better styling. But the 1500cc motor that first was put out there was a 45 horsepower 1500cc with a single carburetor, a single Solex side draft carburetor. And the reason it was a side draft, instead of going down, it went sideways, was because they were trying to compact the motor, right, to fit into the rear of the car and still allow a storage space back there. And so the single carb side draft model was used from 61 to 63. And then in 64 model, they came out with the 2 separate short 32 PDSIT dual carb setup.
So 64 is the first year for the dual carb setup on the Type 34.
And they came out with the high compression motor at that time because they wanted to hot rod it and make it more desirable, of course, to speed up and make the cars sell quicker. Mm-hmm. And that one had a 54 horsepower, which was 10 more than the earlier cars. And it was the first Volkswagen to hit 100 miles an hour.
And that's what's funny is I did a podcast with the guys that do the Renan Andrin in Belgium, and the I guess that's the reason that the notchback was so popular is because they were racing the notchbacks because they were able to break, what was it? Was it 100 miles an hour or 100 kilometers an hour?
Definitely 100 miles an hour. I mean, no Volkswagen had done that before. 100 kilometers an hour is about 62 miles an hour, so any Volkswagen could do that. But the regular single carbureted Volkswagen Type 34s could only go about 87 miles an hour. And when you added the dual carbs in there, that's what gave it enough power with the high compression motor to get you up to 100.
Now, Transacts on the early ones on this, are they different? Short of numbers, is the gearing any different in the early models?
Yeah, all the Type 34 gearing had a real long fourth gear to get you up there quicker. It had, I'm not sure the actual spec numbers on it right off the top of my head, mm-hmm. but the earliest one, like this one, used the same trans as a Beetle, and then it was upgraded and beefed up a little bit for the Type 3.
Now, when you start the restoration process, how much of the body is still original to the car since it was in Arizona for so long? I mean, it had to be in Arizona for a long, long time if it wasn't really rotten.
Yeah, you would think so. I mean, we're all guessing at that point, because if you think from 1962 to 2005, that's 40 years,
Yeah.
right? So it had 40 years to be somewhere else. We don't know where that is. This car is the original body. There are no major panels that were cut and replaced. It has the original front end, the original rear end, because it had never been hit. There were tiny little sections of metal, maybe 8 inches or so, that were cut out where the rust was along the rocker panels. There were a tiny section on the rear area where the apron was that was cut out and replaced. But I would say this car probably has 99%, 98% of its original body.
Which is pretty unique to be able to pull that much original of the metal together. I mean, it's just a real fortunate circumstance for these cars, because if you contrast this with the one that was in Canada, I mean, environment has everything to do with survival of these cars, because that car was, I mean, it was rotten enough to the point where you just chopped it up and threw it in a crate, right?
Absolutely. The vast majority of Type 34s rusted out beyond salvageability. And so that's why we only have 1,800 out of 40,000 cars left. The attrition was incredibly high. I have tried to dig through the history books to see if Volkswagen asked the Karmann factory to dip their cars, meaning they used to take body shells that were finished for Beetles and buses, and they would dunk them in a giant acid dip to coat the whole car in every nook and cranny. Well, I'm not sure Karmann actually done that. I don't see any old pictures of any Type 1 or Type 3 Karmann Ghia being dunked in those acid dips. And what that means to me is that those cars did not have the same level of protection from rust and corrosion that Beetles and buses did, which is why I think they rust out so easily.
Well, I would also think that probably a rate for high attrition on these cars, I would have to guess, would be specifically bodywork damage, right? If you crunch the front nose in this thing, it's not a cheap repair. And back in the days when you would have a car that wasn't that expensive, but now all of a sudden it's going to cost so much money to fix it, I think people would just, people get in a bad accident, they would just scrap cars. I can't tell you how many buses. I found a bus in a wrecking yard, an early walkthrough bus, and it was there because the side was crunched pretty good. And it was, people were just kind of like, they're not so expensive that you need to just restore it. You might as well, or rebuild it, just get another one. So it's well, and there weren't a huge supply of NOS panels for repairs out there. With these cars never being sold by dealers in the US, you had none. Imagine having none and trying to keep these cars on the roads, after a repair. A lot of people used Bondo. A lot of people used fiberglass. I remember my right-hand drive car from South Africa came with huge panels of fiberglass instead of metal, because either they were too cheap or they couldn't get access to the real metal panels. Yeah. So big problem. Yeah. And that probably is another big reason why a lot of them didn't survive. Now, who did most of the body work on this car?
So there's a guy named Francisco. I won't give you his last name. Francisco has done the San Diego Type 34s. We have probably 5 cars that have gone through him. So he is a specialist knowing all the nooks and cranny of a Type 34. He's also has history in doing high-end Porsche, Ferrari, Lamborghini type work. So his quality was super high. He only uses metal. He uses leading if he needs to. And he spends a great deal of time on the body without slapping on Bondo. And for me and for this particular car, also for Pedro and Jack's cars, we don't want Bondo. We want the car to last forever. Yeah. So it went to Francisco. He had some spare time. He knew this was an important project. He came here to the workshop and looked over this nasty red disassembled body and said, yeah, I can do it. And sure enough, in about 8 months, he did. And I checked the work as it happened over the month's time and would go visit it and take pictures as it happened along the way. And Francisco just did a phenomenal job with the coach belt body and panels without having to replace the original metal. So we were really happy with that.
Now, with respect to gauges, you track down year correct gauges. Is there any difference from 62 to 63 on the gauges other than the date stamps?
Absolutely. Gauges are one of those. The speedometer in specific, the Speedo on an early 62 like this has some extra design lines in the numerical face of the gauges.
Mm-hmm.
And those lines for the 10 and 5 mile an hour increments were only used for several months up to maybe April or May of 62. And then they swapped it out and just did the 10th mile per hour increments from that point on. So these early gauges for the Speedo are really difficult to find. Now, I drive in San Diego, and we drive in miles per hour. So most of the earliest cars from Sweden and Germany and some of the other places are in kilometers per hour. And so I had to find a super early Speedo, and it had to be miles per hour. So I got super lucky in finding that. One of my oldest buddies, Andy Holmes, is in Maids Morton in England. And he had restored an early one as well and was able to find a miles per hour speedometer that needed to be restored. And I was able to buy that from him with a bunch of other parts, engine parts and stuff. And Andy really covered a lot of the parts that I never thought I would ever find again.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, it's so interesting. And I think sometimes we take it for granted when we buy a new vehicle. Every 6 months, the dealer may an update, the manufacturer might make an update, change a gauge, change a knob, do this, do that, which we pay no attention to until we get to where a car is 60 years old. And a guy like you is pursuing it to restore it to the best of your ability to get it as close to factory accurate as possible, you know?
Yeah.
It's super unique. Now, is the shifter, like, can you give me a rundown of some of the stuff that's a little unique, like the shifter knobs different, things like that? Is there early and late?
Right. So in early 62, they had a solid ivory gear shift knob that ran through the 1962 series. And in fact, the original convertibles, the 6 original convertibles that are left, were found with solid ivory shift knobs, even though they were 63 models. So that was kind of unique. The Volkswagen and Karmann carried over that shift knob from the early cars into the convertible. There's also a 2-piece fresh air grill on the dash for the fresh air controls, or a 2-piece design with 2 trims, 2 chromes, and built-in levers, which would have been extraordinarily expensive to create. And so in 63, they changed it to a 1-piece trim with removable knobs and arms, levers. The earliest Type 34s also had some other parts that were used only for 62 throughout that series. The scripts, the emblems, the nose emblem that's cast on the front there, it's a rectangular badge. That was only used through 62 as well. Again, must have been very expensive to make and to cost and added for the cost of the car. So in 63, they came out with a simple aluminum round VW nose emblem, just like the Karmann Ghia had. In fact, it shares that emblem with the Type 14 Karmann Ghia. So there are a lot of little detail parts over the years that 62 had, one of which is the Lemeritz 15-inch beauty rings that go around the edge of the rims. Those were only used in 62. In 63, they came out with a slotted version of those beauty rings. There are just a ton of little detail differences that we found, that Pedro and I found as we were going through the restoration, like the fresh air boxes, which you would never think would need to be changed because they're not visible.
Right.
But the fresh air boxes that are underneath the grills here were unique to 62. They had an angular fit versus a rounded design seen in 63 and later. And so we were shocked that it must have been a functional change is the only thing we could think of.
Yeah.
The lower dash pad was another one where the collar that goes over the steering column, the collar of that dash pad was an inch thick in the earliest cars. And then they changed it to half an inch thick. So finding a dash pad for a 6-month production cycle lower dash pad would have been it still is incredibly hard to find. There's a couple of our group that are trying to accurately restore the early 62s. Scott Taylor's one of them. And we all need that lower dash pad with the 1-inch collar.
Right.
And, nobody has it. So you have to fit what you can fit and keep your eyes open for those parts that are eventually going to show up, and then you buy them and add them to the cars. So that's kind of why a Type 34 is never fully restored.
Well, and you were also mentioning just a second ago, because on the screen I have a shot of the dash where you can see the dash has the double slotted fresh air vents, to where my car has a single slot to mount the air vent. So it was, right. I would assume it's probably for production as well, when they're manufacturing the car, just to make it a little faster to produce, rather than have all these. Or
cheaper
things.
cheaper to make one part instead of two. Who knows?
Right.
Progressive Refinements documented all those changes over the years, not just for Type 34s, but for other cars too, for Beetles and Karmann Ghias, and they have documented all the exact dates of the serial numbers that they stopped and made those changes with. I love to see, and I'm sure you feel the same way, that learning about the differences between a year or a model year or a series of months, like a Zwitter bug, makes it so much more exciting.
Yeah.
Where you learn in the process of restoring the car why this car is so special and what makes it so difficult and so wonderful to see an accurately restored car. Yeah,
it's almost like it's not just, it's less than a treasure hunt. It's more like detective work, like solving a mystery, especially when some part or piece is missing. Now, I'm looking at a picture that's on the screen right now of the rear drain tray by the air intake for the motor, and there's normally it's got a slotted grill that's over that hole.
Right. So there's that water drain channel is what that is.
Yeah.
So that when rain comes down the deck lid, it jumps into that channel and is quickly taken away from the motor through a little hole. In the earliest cars like this one, there's just a hole. And in a few months after production in 62, they came up with the 3 grill that covers that hole. And the reason for that was they were finding that debris that was put in the back compartment, like rags, cleaning cloths, papers, whatever, were getting drawn into that hole and going and blocking up that hole. So they added the grills a little bit after production to make that a better usable feature of the car. And then they slapped a little decal in the gutter there that you might be able to see that says basically, don't put anything in this area because it's going to get sucked in. And so they're just continual refinements. That small little round hole is a really big signifier for the earliest of the early cars. There's another one that is the engine hanger. In a Type 3 motor, you have a flat pancake motor, and then at the back of it, you have an engine hanger that supports the back end of the motor. And it's got basically a tube that enters this little donut-shaped thing. Well, that engine hanger in the earliest ones was solid. There was no hole in it. And then for some reason, later on in 62, they added a hole in that little engine hanger area. I don't know if it's functional, but it's one of those visual cues that you can look back at when you find an extremely early car and say, wow, that's a solid engine hanger. And it worked for the Type 3s as well, the notchbacks. There are a few out there that still have that solid engine hanger.
Well, and what's funny is if you're a guy just going through a mountain of parts and you bought a stash somebody's inventory and you've just got these engine hangers, and you're like, oh, this one must be modified. Somebody must have, because, sometimes the early models are a little crude once they get into refinement and reproduction. So I wonder how many of those things have been pitched in the garbage. Now, at the rear drain tray at the back, I see there's no grate over the top of it. When did they add the grate?
So that's another series in late 63 model year. They added the metal grates over that area because apparently things were still getting sucked in the motor. There's a channel that's behind the water drain channel that air goes in from the rear deck lid down through the back of the car and goes in a tunnel that goes into the motor where the crank is. And if you have anything in the back of that area, it's going to potentially get sucked into that air intake area, which you want to, of course, avoid.
Right.
So adding those metal grills was one way of catching and preventing stuff from getting into those areas and causing problems.
Now, as far as so you got the paint done by your friend who you shall only know by his first name, similar to Cher, Francisco the painter. We're just going to refer to him as. Now he did the paint and body, and then as far as interior, let's talk about interior. We know that's I'm assuming it's Pedro interior in that bad boy.
Yeah. So Type 34's interiors are grouped by an early style, which ran from 62 to 64. And then they went to a cheaper monotone type interior, vinyl. And the early cars had a cloth inserts with colors. And there were like 5 or 6 different colors that you could have as cloth inserts for the interior. And the seats were two-tone, if you want to say that, vinyl on the outside and cloth in the centers. Mm-hmm. And the door panels were as well. The upper half was vinyl, the lower half was this cloth. And in previous years, this cloth, of course, got destroyed over the years, and there was never any reproduction cloth. Well, Pedro, back a long time ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, decided when he was doing his 62 Type 34 that he wanted that original Type 34 cloth again. So we were able to dig up samples from original cloth interiors, send them to SMS, which is in Oregon, and they reproduced that cloth in all the different colors. So there's a red cloth, there's a silver cloth, there's a blue cloth, and I think there's a turquoise cloth. I'm not sure we reproduced the yellow cloth, but there's different colors that were reproduced. And Pedro is phenomenal at getting the details accurate. And with he and I working together to get all the right details and the way that the folds were done on the upholstery and the distance between the heat pleats, all the seams, he was able to create an authentic 62 interior. And absolutely, we had to have it for this car.
Now, tell me a little bit about the steering wheel, about the horn ring on that steering wheel.
Right. So normal Type 34, stock Type 34s that came off the line in the early years had a half moon steering horn ring, just like a Beetle had. Mm-hmm. And one of the optional accessories you could get to bling it up a little bit from the dealer for Beetles, for Karmann Ghias, whatever, was a full circle horn ring, but it had a bend in the top so you could see the gauges as you were driving. And the full circle horn ring, that's called a bent horn ring, was reproduced several years ago. And I think they add a lot of class and elegance to the dash of the Type 34 and give it that extra bit of something cool.
Well, what's interesting when you look at the early vehicles that are produced, they, everything that makes pushing the horn easier, dialing the radio easier, shifting the car, anything that makes it a little bit easier is like a luxury that they add to these vehicles as they continue through production. So it's funny because they say, well, why would somebody want a big horn ring like that? Well, it makes it easy no matter where your hand's at to hit the horn. And
one of the changes they made in 64, right? Because mm-hmm. those horn rings were getting broken. Right. People were getting in the car and they would hold onto the horn ring and break it. And so in 64, they got rid of the horn ring altogether and just made a bar that went across the horizontal portion of the steering wheel. So in 64, you'll see a straight horn bar that was used through 65 as well. And that super simplified the horn, didn't it? Yeah. You just had one side or the other to push down on. There were no horn ring pieces to break.
Well, and what's interesting is you see from the functionality and the use of the cars, the manufacturers start to change all types of little pieces. So yeah, I was looking at a picture here a few minutes ago of the side, the seat adjustment knob, it's pretty funny that they would put it there, and thinking like, how in the world would you be able to adjust that seat knob with it jammed down there in that little tiny space there for your hand? I mean, it's crazy looking. And it moved, didn't it? It moved to the front of the seat, right, with a big giant rotating knob in the 63 model year. So
Yeah, there's all kinds of cool little differences. And imagine trying to find a set of early 62 seats with the right metal chrome side adjustment knob.
Well,
It just was impossible. So
and was
I got super lucky.
Are the side spears on the seat different on the 62?
They are, because in 62, the way that you made the front backrest come forward to get in the back seat was you lifted up a knob that was at the top of the seat. You lifted it up, so the trim piece that went underneath it had a cutout in it, so you could lift it up and down. And then it was late 62, I think, they changed that spear. They got rid of the piece for the cutout, and they put the knob down at the lower portion of the actual seat frame, so it didn't interfere with the trim. Obviously a cost-saving maneuver, but probably also there's mechanical shafts and springs that go through that seat from the top to the bottom to release that catch. And so it probably made it much simpler to build just a local, simple adjustment knob on the base of the seat.
Yeah, it's wild looking because, it's those types of things. Now, is that piece aluminum as well, or is that piece steel, that stainless?
No, all that is aluminum. All that's anodized aluminum on the inside.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so nuanced, the minor differences of these early models, that it's so cool to see the different modifications. I mean, the seat adjustment knob, the horn, the shifter knob, the speedo details, so many different things. Now, as far as the interior, Pedro did the interior, you guys got that wrapped up. The glass, all that stuff you found was in decent shape when you got it, or
So glass is tough because a lot of it, the pieces that did come with it were scratched beyond compare, unusable. And so I had to search out NOS glass, NOS door glass from the Philippines, NOS windshield glass if I could. I wasn't able to find an NOS rear window. So if you find one of those, let me know. The one I've got it on it now is an original one, but it's got a nice big scrape in it, like a glass that's been sitting around has.
Yeah.
When it's not on a car, it tends to get scrapes. Vent window frame, I bought NOS for the glass for that. Pop-out windows that you can see on the back side there, we got those in really good original shape from France, I believe. So I was when you do a restoration like this, you can't go half-assed, right? You can't put an old crusty part on it. And so it really draws out the length and the frustration that it takes to find those parts. Me being connected with everybody always helps, of course, and sharing. I kept updating the group, the Type 34 World group, with the progress of this car. So all the 1,800 people in the world that saw it felt like they were happy to contribute where they found a good part. And so that was the whole story behind this. It was preserved for the car's sake of doing the oldest car the right way with the right parts and sharing the information as we went along, to try and make things easier for other people that had early cars or later cars.
Yeah. And electrical, is anything different with respect to electrical details from early to late?
There really isn't.
Okay.
The wiring diagram for all the years up through the single carb cars were all the same. And we were able to get the new wiring harness from ISP West. There's a guy named Greg out of Colorado that is a super detail-oriented guy, that he went to the effort of actually creating the very first accurate color-coded Type 34 wiring harness with the built-in fog lights, with the built-in dual horns, that kind of thing. And he was able to create that kit and get it mass-produced for ISP West to sell. So that was super fortunate. I would never do another car without replacing a wiring harness. Yeah. Now the 6-volt lights work like they should. The horns go off like they should. The signals blink while the brakes work, while the headlights work. Wiring harness was super important.
Yeah, there's so many people. Now, anybody that you wanted to thank the car is immaculate. And again, you guys that are listening, it's in this month's in December 2024 Hot VWs, but to really hear the story behind the car, there's only so much they can get in the pages. Anything about this car that we haven't touched on that you wanted to touch on?
Well, the motor is a big one. Because it didn't come with a motor, and I didn't want to put a dual carb motor in it. I really, really, really wanted an extremely early serial number Type 3 motor.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you remember, but we had some wildfires, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, called the Camp Fire.
Yeah.
It was up in Northern California, and it just burned out entire neighborhoods of Paradise. And one of the cars that got burned up during that fire was a early 62 Sea Blue Type 34 by coincidence. And the owner of that car had pulled the old motor, kept it in his garage, and put a brand new 1600 motor in it. Well, that got burned up, and he still had the motor. And that was an 11,000 serial number motor.
Oh, wow.
From December of 61. So it was almost karma that this Sea Blue 62 died, and its motor, its heart, got transplanted into the oldest one. So, I mean, it's the oldest Type 3 motor I've seen. And now it's been rebuilt correctly by my buddy Ron and matched up with this car. So that was a huge step with it. We're never going to find the original motor, of course, which would have been about a 2000 serial number, but 11,000 is pretty close.
Yeah, it's the lengths you got to go through to get these things put together as accurate as possible. Now, did you do any hypo mods to the motor?
I did not. This is completely stock, 1500 cc, regular compression, 45 horsepower, 6 volt, everything stock. There are a lot of unique little early 62 parts on it that were NOS that we added to it to make it more authentic looking. And it just looks fantastic. It's as good as I could have ever hoped to assemble.
Now I'm noticing on the stamping, it says 34T on the front of the housing. Was that on that original, the original motor that you got from your friend?
Yeah. So that's the motor that we got from him. And the housings were stamped 34 when, it's a little backstory, but when Volkswagen made the motors for the Type 3s, which they made at Wolfsburg, right? And then they shipped the completed motors with the chassis over to Karmann to be mated with the bodies. So the motors were built at Wolfsburg. When Volkswagen built an especially good motor that had very high spec, very good compression, the best tested motors, they slapped a Type 34 logo on it and had those mated with Type 34s.
Really?
So that's a function that Volkswagen never admitted to, but the Volkswagen employees will tell you that story. Same with black bodies. The bodies that were the straightest possible metal bodies were tagged with a black, and they would paint those cars black because a black obviously needs a super straight body. And the motors were the same way. Motors that were tested at super high values above spec were slated for Type 34s.
Wow. And who's the first person that told you that?
We have Jörg Fischer and a couple other guys that are in Germany that work with and talk with and meet with for coffee with the original Karmann workers that were at the Karmann plant in 1960s. And he meets with them and asks simple questions to try and get their memory banks going again. And that's some of them. A lot of what we learned about the prototype construction and the convertible development process was through these old factory workers at Karmann.
Wow. That's so cool. Because it makes sense, right? Because the Razor was like the high-end car, and the sedan, the every person. Do you remember? Do you know what the price differential was between the Razor and the notchback?
I think it was about 30% more to buy a Type 34 than a notchback. The notchback was the Beetle, basically the sedan version of the Type 3 series.
Right.
I think the difference between a Type 14 Karmann Ghia and a Type 34 Karmann Ghia was probably less than that, maybe 25% difference.
Mm-hmm.
And in those days, everybody wanted their Volkswagen to go faster with a 1200 cc. So it was almost a no-brainer that a 1500 would be the choice if you could afford to buy it. In US dollars, back then, it would have been about $2,100 when a
Yeah.
Porsche 356 was about $3,500.
Yeah.
So it was still a reasonable priced car for what you got. And the build quality of the coach building is amazing, right? I mean, the fit and finish of the panels, the fit and finish of the doors, the seams, the glass, everything was top notch, was awesome. Just like you found with your Type 34, that it's a step above a regular Karmann Ghia.
Yeah, they're definitely a lot more work than a regular Volkswagen sedan for building, for fit, for finish, all that kind of stuff. And I mean, it was really Volkswagen's attempt to, make their quote unquote real car, right? Like this is when you graduate from the Beetle, you get the Type 3. So
that's right.
Now, was there anything specific?
Yeah, and the people that wanted the reliability of a Volkswagen, but they wanted the cool look of a Class C sports car, that's what you go to. Or if you wanted your wife to drive something spectacular that nobody else in your village had, you'd get a Type 34.
And interestingly enough, if you think back to that time, Type 34 was known, or the Volkswagen itself was known for reliability. And then you'd have other cars around, Italian cars or Swedish cars or whatever. But then I think when Volkswagen introduced this, like, here's a really high line VW. So it was kind of like the VW Phaeton of that time, right? Like Volkswagen wanted to put their reliability together with a really elegant, nice looking coach built car. And I think it's probably the people that were really brand loyal but wanted something exotic but something that was reliable were probably the Type 34 buyers,
Well, isn't that why we drive them?
Yeah, the sensible.
We don't drive a Corvair for a reason.
Yeah.
We don't drive a Simca or a Triumph Spitfire for a reason. We drive a reliable, classy, beautiful Volkswagen that also has an incredible following.
Well, that's
and that's the beauty trifecta of vintage Volkswagens is that they don't go out of style, and people always want something bigger, something better, and a new challenge to restore.
Yeah. Now, is there anything different about the dome light in the interior, or is that the same as?
No, the dome light was the same. In fact, the same as the 356 Porsche.
And I know the reverse lights are 356 Porsche as well, too, right?
The reverse lights?
Well, the license plate lights. Yes. Excuse me. Yeah.
So the license plate lights are actually on this car are unique for about a month of production. They have a dual license lights built into the rear bumper guards, and they're on the inner side of them. So they point up towards the license plate, and they look like Porsche 356 ones, but they're not the same. They were made by the same supplier, of course. Hella made them all, but the glass, the plastic lens on this one has the writing for that light stamped into the lens, whereas the chrome surrounding portion of it has no text. And for both the Porsche 356 and the other Type 34 models later on, the text was transferred to the chrome part on the trim piece.
Oh, okay.
So these license plate lights were ridiculously hard to find.
Yeah.
Used for about 1 month of production.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Well,
and the way that I went about finding it, guess how?
How?
I posted a picture because I had one of them. I posted a picture on our Type 34 group, and I said, I badly need another one of these. Here's how it's different than all the other ones. Who has one? And sure enough, my buddy Bernd from Sweden raised his hand and said, I got one. And now we have a matching set.
And he just had one?
He had one. He didn't have a pair. And he had kept this one. He knew it was different. And he had kept it in his stock supply for 30 years, knowing someone would need it at some point. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a epitome of this whole car. All my amigos, everybody that I know, stepped up when it was needed and really shared the parts, shared the work, and made the car ridiculously beautiful. And I couldn't be happier. It's going to be the last restoration I ever do, and I'm happy to go out on a high.
That's it. Well, it's they're obviously labors of love, and I've got on the screen the picture of the team that you had there when you married the body to the chassis, and
Yeah.
it's definitely
And some
something.
Patron.
Yeah, it's definitely something where everybody gets together to kind of see. It's just being part of the build of that car, is kind of reminiscent of the people in the factory, right? The people that work hard together collectively to get something out there that's produced that's really, really unique and special. And so I think it couldn't be a better guy that has the oldest one in the registry than Mr. Lee Hedges, man. It's just, listen, you've done a lot for this hobby and a lot specifically for the Type 34, and it's so consuming, and it's something we do purely out of the labor of love, even though, some guys do them custom, some guys do them all original. And, but I think it's so cool, the varieties of so many that are out there. And, again, I'm pretty biased, but I love the Type 34, and it's just the best looking car, that Volkswagen made, in my opinion,
Oh, and it's not only great looking, but as you know, they drive ridiculously well.
Oh yeah.
They handle like a 914. They are comfortable and quiet and elegant, and you're the only guy driving one when you're out there.
That's it.
And everybody's got it on their list. So we've worked really hard over the past 40 years to make Type 34s more aware, make people more aware of what it is and how to do them right and what the differences are. And I think there's just a ton of really great quality Type 34s that are popping up. There's some phenomenal restored custom ones as well that, people have put their stamp on, not only yours, but others that have come out of Spike's shop that are just, jaw-droppingly beautiful.
Yeah.
And it's a body style that can really take all the modifications that somebody wants and preserve that classy style of car.
Yeah, no, there's no question. I mean, they're just, what's so unique. I mean, for me particularly, just loving so much of these cars is that they just have it. It looks like an Italian sports car, with that German reliability. And it's like, it's the sensible exotic, right? I think it's the best way to describe it, so,
and you've driven your Beetles and your Karmann Ghias and your things and your notchbacks. And once you get in a Type 34 and experience it, right away, you notice a difference. There's something special about it, and you can only really experience it by getting in and driving it. So I'm sure that you were that way when you did your first gray one.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, that there's nothing better, in my opinion, than cruising around Type 34. And usually when you show up to a car show, you're probably the only one there.
That's right.
So,
and you're talking to everybody about the history and the education as well.
No, they're awesome, man. Well, Lee, man, you guys that are listening, get out there and get your December 2024 Hot VWs on the cover. It's the Myers-Manx 60th anniversary, so you can get the companion to go along with this podcast. There's a ton of great pictures in here. The photo shoot on it is fantastic. It really, getting to know some of the detailed history behind the build is just really special, especially with a car, that's built, by a team of enthusiasts that just love to see these things come together and get put back on the road. So you guys make sure that you get out there and purchase this month's, let's sell out this month's Hot VW December 2024. When you see it on the shelf, go grab it so you guys can get your copy of the podcast companion for this week's episode of Let's Talk Dubs. Well,
I appreciate you. I appreciate you having me on and sharing the story about this car and doing everything you do to make this a much more enjoyable hobby. Well, you're doing an amazing job.
Well, we got to get Pedro on too, because Pedro's, the next chapter is when you got the oldest one, and then you're going to build a tribute to a prototype, which I think is is pretty awesome. And before we wrap up, is there anybody in particular that you wanted to thank for being part of the build that you can think of that we may not have touched base on? But I'm sure there's a laundry list of people.
There is. I mean, my direct amigos, the 4 people are Pedro Saints, Jack Fisher, Eric Hand, and Jason Weigel. We had John House in there. We had Lionel Mendoza in there that took care of things. We had, just Andy Holmes we talked about, and Karsten from Germany, Karsten Klein, and all my buddies, Bernd in Sweden, to pick up all those cool parts. So it couldn't have done it without any of these guys, and it is definitely a group effort. So
no, for sure, man. Well, Lee, man, thanks for coming on the podcast, and I'm looking forward to you and me cruising our Type 34s together somewhere. So I need to know,
can't wait,
when the next thing is that I can come down there and be a part of, because I think the next show that's on schedule for me currently is in 2 weeks. I'm going to take Zorba to the Good Guys show in Scottsdale, and I'm going to show with Buddy Hale and a couple of those guys.
Perfect.
Because, what's interesting is we were talking recently as the SEMA show's going on, and, I'm running into Buddy down there and we're getting ready to do a podcast, but we were just kind of talking about, where can you go? What shows can you go to where these cars really get appreciated versus, just kind of everybody's looking for the newest, wildest thing, but just for people to appreciate these cars. And hopefully next year we'll get a group of the Type 34s come out to one crazy weekend and get a bunch of Type 34s on display.
Next year in October, since there's no Type 3 rally going on, I will definitely bring Amy out to Vegas.
Nice.
And cruise next to you in yours.
That's it. That would be fantastic to see 10 Type 34s cruising down the strip. So let's see how many people we can get with Type 34s to come out next year to one crazy weekend, because, they're, listen, it's a special kind of people that cruise those cars. But
that's true.
I may be biased. So,
and we'll have to swap our Type 34s to give each other a different idea of what it's like. Yeah. I've never been in a nicely customized one with a bit of extra power on it. So
yeah, well,
it'll be nice to take yours for a cruise.
That's it for sure. We'll swap for sure. It'd be fun to do, because I don't think I've ever driven a stock one.
There you go.
The very first thing I do is lower them. So, but no, Lee, thanks for coming on, man. And anybody needs interior, they can reach out to Pedro through Type 34 World. If you guys have more information, go check out the Facebook. It's really a Facebook group now.
Yeah.
Do you still have the website up that you had for a while?
Yeah, the website's still active at T34world.org. Mm-hmm. That has a ton of information for everybody to access. And the Facebook group is for owners. So if you're an owner, get in touch with us through the T34 World Facebook group, and I'll add you to the group, and we'll introduce you and get you rolling.
Well, that's awesome, man. Well, Lee, again, man, thanks for coming on the show, and I look forward to seeing it at our next get together.
Sounds great. Good to see you again, Bill.
You got it, buddy. Well, I hope you guys were able to learn a lot on that podcast. I certainly learned a lot, and you can never go wrong learning more about your favorite hobby, and this is my favorite hobby. But I appreciate you guys for listening. If you want to support the podcast, go to letstalkdubs.com, pick up some merch. It's getting cold out there. We do have some sweatshirts available on the podcast if you'd like to, on the website, if you'd like to pick up some merch and support your boy. Also, if you want to get a shout out, give us a review on Apple Podcasts. You can even go on my Facebook page and throw out a review and message me. You got any stories you want to share with me or anything like that, you can DM me on Instagram, Facebook, or any of those things. If it's something in depth with photographs and all that cool stuff, send it to me at bill@letstalkdubs.com, and we'll definitely get you on there. Last week, the bins episode was a suggestion from one of our listeners. And so if you guys have any suggestions for podcasts or details you want to hear about, let me know. You might catch me in the right mood and get yourself a bins podcast out just like that. So Appreciate all you guys for listening. Thanks for your support, and make sure you share this podcast with all your friends. So any of your friends in the VW scene, copy the link that you're listening to this on, email it, send it to them, text them, send it by snail mail. I don't care how you get to it, but share the podcast with your friends so that we can keep it growing organically. It's getting some traction. And also go check out the YouTube channel for this particular podcast. I've got the whole thing on video. So you guys will want to go check that out. I pan through some pictures and some stuff like that. So you'll definitely enjoy checking it out. So I'm into it. I love it. I appreciate you guys for listening. And don't forget, we do have scheduled dates for next year's One Crazy Weekend. Next year's One Crazy Weekend is the first weekend of October. And that's going to be October 2nd through the 4th. October 2nd through the 4th is going to be One Crazy Weekend 2025. I'm going to officially launch it next week, but if you guys got to put in for your time, get that going so that you can make sure you don't miss next year's One Crazy Weekend. It's going to be bigger. It's going to be better. And there's going to be a lot more space this next time. So it's still going to be at the Orleans Hotel Casino, but we'll be letting you guys know a lot of the info on that. This next year coming up is going to be a bowling tournament, a poker tournament that are going to happen the Thursday and Friday before the Saturday car show and all that stuff. So it's going to be a weekend full of awesome stuff that's going to be happening at the Orleans Hotel Casino next year, 2025, October 2nd through the 4th. So there's also, what do I mean? The 5th also, George is doing a bike ride the day after the car show on Sunday. So if you got your big ripper in town you want to buzz around, hit up George on the 5th. Ride your BMX bike with a bunch of people in Vegas. So make sure you guys come check it out. Information will be on the website by the end of this month. So until next week, guys, later.
You probably don't know that there's a new Volkswagen out that doesn't look like a Volkswagen.